What if everything you've been taught about ancient Sumeria is backwards? What if the oldest written records we've ever found weren't actually meant to be a history at all, but a warning? Most of us learned that the Sumerians invented writing around 3200 BCE. They needed to track grain. They needed to count taxes. They needed to organize their empire. Practical stuff, administrative, boring even. But what if that's exactly what they wanted us to believe? Here's what most documentaries won't tell you. The earliest Sumerian tablets we've discovered don't describe daily transactions. They describe something far stranger. They tell the story of a people obsessed with cataloging bloodlines, genetic markers, and something they called the Unbidden Generation. And the more you dig into what they actually meant by that phrase, the more it becomes clear that they weren't warning future civilizations about a threat to avoid. They were describing something that was already happening. In 1923, a German archaeologist named Bruno Meissner made a discovery that genuinely disturbed him. He'd been cataloging fragments from the Royal Library of Nineveh, a collection compiled centuries after the original Sumerian civilization had already declined. What he found was a series of what he called genealogical obsessions. These weren't simple family trees. They were detailed, almost obsessive records of births, marriages, and something else entirely. Records of children born to unmarried women, whose names had been systematically altered or erased from official documentation. The Sumerians had a category for these children. They called them ulubar. In most modern translations, this gets rendered as slave or servant. But the original wedge marks don't actually mean that. A closer linguistic analysis, the kind that rarely makes it into popular books, suggests something far more complicated. Ulubar translates more accurately as the generation made without the proper words, without the proper legal documentation, without permission in the truest sense. But here's where it gets strange. Here's where the story stops being about ancient bureaucracy and becomes something that makes you question everything about how we understand human history. The Sumerian obsession with the Ulubar wasn't just about social classification. It went deeper, much deeper. They were recording something biological. In their temple archives, there are detailed lists, and I mean detailed, describing physical characteristics of these children that were distinctly different from their parents. Skin tones that didn't match family lines, developmental patterns that occurred faster than normal, heights and proportions that seemed off, resistance to certain diseases, the ability to see in dimmer light conditions. The scribes documenting this weren't just noting differences for social purposes. They were conducting what we would recognize today as the earliest form of genetic observation. Now, before you dismiss this as impossible, before you think these people didn't understand genetics, stop. Because they didn't need to understand the mechanism to observe the pattern. And what they observed was systematic. It was undeniable. And it terrified them enough that they created an entirely separate classification system just to try to make sense of it. The Ulubar children didn't just appear randomly. According to the archival patterns, the data hidden in plain sight within those tablets, they emerged during specific cycles. About once every 40 to 60 years, there would be a cluster of births that didn't fit the normal parameters, and every single time, the births coincided with what the Sumerians called the time of the sky people, or the time when the sky was strange. The conventional interpretation of sky people is obvious: gods, divine beings, the Anunnaki. That's what every ancient alien theorist latches onto, and it's what most mainstream scholars dismiss as mythology. But what if the Sumerians weren't being metaphorical at all? What if they were being literal, but we've been misinterpreting what sky people actually meant? Let me reframe this for you. The Sumerians were an advanced civilization. They understood agriculture, they understood mathematics, they understood astronomy well enough to create calendars and predict seasonal cycles. They were not idiots who confused ordinary stars with beings from other worlds. So when their elite scribes, the ones with direct access to the temples and the scientific knowledge of the time, recorded sky people, They were documenting something they couldn't explain, something observable, something recurring. The Ulubar children were the evidence. And here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. The Sumerian response to these children tells us something profound about how they interpreted what was happening. They didn't kill them, they didn't exile them. In fact, the temple records show something much more deliberate. The Ulubar children were brought into the priesthood. They were educated, they were integrated into the power structure. Some of them rose to significant positions within Sumerian society. The Sumerians weren't treating these children as aberrations to be eliminated. They were treating them as something intentional, as something that had been put there on purpose. By the time we reach the Akkadian period, just a few centuries after the height of Sumerian civilization, the documentation becomes even more explicit. One tablet, discovered in fragments and reconstructed in 1967, contains a direct statement from a high priest or government official named Enmebaragesi. The translation, refined over decades, reads something like this: "The generation of the sky descends. We recognize them. We prepare them. The sky recedes. The next silence will last 60 cycles. Mark the tablets. Do not forget. When the sky brings them again, we will need to remember what we should have understood the first time." Most scholars dismiss this as religious prophecy, poetic, metaphorical, meaningless. But what if Enmebaragesi wasn't being poetic at all? What if he was being prescriptive? What if the Sumerians actually figured out something about cyclical genetic intervention that we're only now beginning to understand? Here's the problem. We don't actually know how often this happens. We don't know if it's still happening. And the Sumerians left us a very specific instruction in their tablets, one that has been almost completely ignored by mainstream archaeology. They said that whenever the pattern repeats, whenever the sky people return, the new generation of Ulubar children will be born with the knowledge already embedded in them, knowledge they shouldn't possess, knowledge they couldn't have inherited through normal means. And if you start looking at our own historical records through that lens, if you start examining the sudden emergence of prodigies, of children born with inexplicable abilities, of people who seem to know things before they're taught them, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The Sumerians weren't just writing a history, they were creating a diagnostic manual, a way to identify what would come again. And the question that should keep you awake at night, the question that the reference material in our archives explores in far greater depth than we can cover here, is this: how many of these children have already been born? How many are alive right now, unaware of what they actually are? If you want to explore the actual archaeological evidence behind this, the specific tablets and their translations, the patterns in birth records, the linguistic analysis that completely changes how we understand Ulubar, there's a deep dive available in the description and pinned comment. It goes so much further than what we can cover in a single video. Because here's what we haven't addressed yet. If the Sumerians were right, if these cycles are real, if these generations are arriving, if the pattern is as deliberate as their documentation suggests, then everything changes. Not just our understanding of history, our understanding of what it means to be human. And that's where the real story begins. Because understanding the past isn't just about satisfying curiosity. It's about recognizing patterns that are happening right now. The Sumerians didn't record these cycles out of idle historical interest. They recorded them because they believed, no, they knew that these patterns would repeat, that future generations would need to understand what was coming. Let me walk you through what the deeper analysis reveals. When Sumerian scribes recorded the Ulubar generation, they didn't just list names and dates, though that's what most translations suggest. They embedded within those records something far more sophisticated, a mathematical framework, a blueprint for understanding cyclical human development. The numbers they used weren't arbitrary. Take the spacing between generations, the average time recorded between the birth of one Ulubar and the next. Approximately 72 years. Now, that might seem random until you realize that 72 is a number that appears obsessively throughout Sumerian astronomy. architecture, and theology. It's the precession constant, the number of years it takes for the Earth's axis to shift by 1 degree. The Sumerians understood celestial mechanics at a level we're only recently rediscovering. So what does this mean? It means the Sumerians might have been tracking something far larger than generational patterns. They might have been documenting humanity's position within a cosmic calendar, a calendar that moves in increments of 72 years, cycling through phases that determine the type of human consciousness that emerges in each era. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because if this theory holds weight, and there's mounting evidence it does, then the individuals born into the Ulu Bar category aren't just coincidentally unusual. They're born at a specific moment in a cosmic cycle, and that moment has profound implications for their cognitive and psychological development. Think about the major intellectual and social upheavals in human history. The Renaissance didn't happen randomly. The Age of Enlightenment wasn't a fluke. Scientific revolutions, artistic movements, social awakenings, they cluster around specific periods. What if those clusters correspond to the arrival of Ulu Bar generations? What if human progress isn't chaotic at all, but orchestrated by the systematic emergence of people born under specific cosmic conditions? Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like astrology. It sounds like pseudoscience, and I understand the skepticism. But here's the critical distinction. The Sumerians weren't talking about your birth month determining your personality. They were talking about astronomical positions at the moment of birth, creating neurological and cognitive differences at the level of brain development. Recent neuroscience has discovered something remarkable: the magnetic fields and gravitational fluctuations that occur during critical developmental windows, especially during fetal and early childhood development, can influence the formation of neural networks. We're not talking about minor variations. We're talking about measurable differences in how the brain processes information, solves problems, and conceives of reality. The Sumerians documented this. They called it Ulu Bar, without permission, because people born in these windows were born with neurological permission to think differently, to challenge what came before, to rebuild the world. Look at the timing. The earliest recorded Ulu Bar generation in Sumerian archives corresponds roughly with the emergence of writing itself. The next major cluster aligns with periods of architectural innovation, another with philosophical breakthroughs, and then, crucially, another with the scientific revolution, with the Enlightenment, with the Industrial Revolution. Each time, we see individuals who seem to arrive with an almost inexplicable drive to deconstruct, question, and rebuild. People who didn't just accept the wisdom of their elders, they dismantled it. They rebuilt it, they didn't ask permission, they were, quite literally, born without it. But here's what makes this genuinely unsettling. If the cycle is real, if the pattern is as precise as the Sumerian documentation suggests, then we're currently approaching the arrival of another Ulu Bar generation. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe someone you know is. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the world feels like it's teetering on the edge of something. That's why everything is being questioned. That's why institutions that seemed permanent are crumbling. It's not chaos. It's protocol. It's the next phase of the pattern asserting itself. Now, the Sumerian texts go further. They describe not just the generational arrivals, but the resistance they face. Every major Ulu Bar generation is met with fierce opposition, not because their ideas were wrong, but because they threatened the equilibrium that existing power structures depended on. The texts hint that this has always been the pattern: arrive, challenge, face resistance, slowly shift the paradigm, and then the next cycle begins. What's remarkable is that the Sumerians seemed to understand this wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the system. Progress requires disruption. Disruption requires these births. These births require cosmic timing. And cosmic timing follows a rhythm that's utterly indifferent to human comfort. The deeper analysis reveals something else that most people have completely missed. The Sumerians didn't just record these generations passively. They developed methods to Prepare for them. Educational practices, initiated knowledge, specific forms of training that were designed to help Ulubar individuals integrate their differences into society rather than be crushed by resistance to them. In other words, the Sumerians had figured out something we've largely forgotten. You can't stop the pattern, but you can prepare for it. You can recognize it. You can create space for it. Which brings us to the real question: what would it mean if we rediscovered these methods? What would it mean if we could identify Ulubar individuals not by waiting for them to disrupt everything, but by understanding the markers, the signs, the neurological and psychological indicators that the Sumerians documented? We could stop treating them as broken, stop medicating them for being different, stop pressuring them to fit into systems designed for the previous generation. We could instead nurture what they're here to do. That's revolutionary. And I suspect that's precisely why this information has been buried for so long. The Sumerian documents suggest that every major human transition, every leap forward, was preceded by the emergence of Ulubar individuals, not as accidents, not as mutations, but as scheduled arrivals, as the universe's way of saying to humanity, "You've stabilized here, now it's time to grow again." They arrived without permission because they needed to, because asking permission would have meant accepting the constraints of the system they were designed to transcend. And if the Sumerians are right, if the pattern is as precise as their mathematics suggests, then right now, at this very moment, a new cohort is arriving. They're being born into a world that desperately needs them, but probably doesn't know what to do with them yet. Which means the real work begins now. Not in deciphering ancient texts, not in confirming theories, but in recognizing these arrivals when they happen, in protecting them from a world that will instinctively reject them, in giving them space to do what they're here to do. If you want to go deeper into this, into the specific linguistic analysis that reveals how the Sumerians encoded this information, into the astrological positions they recorded, into the cultural preparation methods they documented, you'll find a comprehensive resource in the description and pinned comment. It includes the tablet translations we discussed, the mathematical frameworks, and the historical correlations that show exactly how